This video is sponsored by Skillshare. Since this channel doesn't want you to enjoy life, I'm making yet another dystopian video. 1984 by George Orwell is a classic. It tells the story of Winston Smith, a minor bureaucrat in a totalitarian state called Oceania, which has been built over the ashes of old Britain. It's set in the year 1984, and we're in the year 2018 now, which means that this is technically an alternate history now, even though it wasn't meant that way when it was written in 1949. But I'm taking it to mean that this gives me free license. It seems like every day with the NSA and Facebook and the like that we're moving closer towards an Orwellian society today. However, how could 1984 have actually happened in 1984? And what would the world look like? That is the question of this alternate history. First, before we get started, this book was absolutely brilliant. If you haven't read it, you should immediately pause this video, check it out at your local library, call in sick from work or school tomorrow and the day after to read it. It's my second favorite book after Les Miserables. Everything is perfectly done. The atmosphere, the message, the world building, and the writing style. I can't even give it a book review because there's simply nothing to critique. This is The World of 1984 by George Orwell. The world is dominated by three megastates. There's Oceania, which is where the novel is set, which controls the Americas, the southern half of Africa, the British Isles, and Australia. It's supposedly a fusing of the British Empire and the United States of America. They're run by INGSOC, an abbreviation of English socialism. They're in a permanent state of war with the two other world powers, Eurasia and East Asia. Eurasia controls continental Europe and Russia. They're the descendant state of the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, East Asia controls China, Japan, and Korea, and is a descendant state of Maoist China. The Arctic and the entire tropics outside of the Americas are an endless battleground and contested between the three main powers. None of the sides involved actually want to win the war, because that would destroy the external pressure that allows them to continually oppress their populations. So the wars are only fought by a small professional soldier class, while the rest of the population is kept down by unnecessary rationing and destruction of liberties. The real resource the powers are fighting over is the extendable slave labor of the tropics. The brilliant thing is this could totally be made up. Oceania has such a tight control on information, no one's sure if Oceania is just Britain and they're making up the entire empire, or if they actually control the entire world, and they're just pretending they're at war. We never get an answer. I'd like to think that if the Americas were part of the empire, we'd see ships of sugar coming up from Brazil, or some Americans with southern accents wandering around London. But knowing Oceania, they'd pick some hidden cove in Devon as their port, and keep their foreign soldiers completely secluded from the native population. So I really don't know. Let's say that the state-published image of the world is accurate for this alternate history, however. I get the feeling you guys are expecting me to tear into the physical world Winston sees in 1984, saying Newspeak is implausible, or that no state could be that bad. However, I can't. The world building in this book is perfect. Almost everything Oceania does has already been done by Stalin or Mao. The other things could be done with modern technology and would have been done by Stalin or Mao if they had said technology. I mean, just look at how the Chinese government is tightening the screws on surveillance, and all the surveillance we face in even Britain or America. The amount of cameras the city of London uses is simply horrifying. On the other hand, I'm basically a libertarian politically, so I'm probably somewhat biased here. I'm sure some communists in the comments will dutifully provide the opposing argument. Just like this last alternate history, we need 3 points of departure for this video. The first is that for America and Britain to unite as communist nations, America actually needs a real communist party. In all its history, America has never really had a communist party, not even a socialist party. We were lurching towards one in the early 20th century during the Gilded Age, in which massive corporate monopolies were dominating the American economy, and the wealth disparity was massive. The socialists are really picking up a lot of strength. However, Teddy Roosevelt went trust-busting, which resulted in the destruction of the monopolies, and World War I meant the US is the only functioning world economy left, which meant that America entered the 20s a happy and rich nation. This wiped out all socialist sentiment. This never happens in this timeline. Teddy Roosevelt never breaks the power of the trusts, and the trusts grew even bigger, completely strangling the American economy. The trusts come to dominate American politics and breed a corrupt list of presidents who only exist to make the trusts grow stronger. Meanwhile, a charismatic man leads the American Communist Party forward, which slowly rises in strength among the dispossessed and pissed. The party is strongest in the interior of the continent, where the farmers and miners are exploited by the railroads, among the overworked immigrants of the cities and the downtrodden southern sharecroppers. They basically take the rug out from the Democratic Party in the same way that the rise of labor destroyed the Whig Party. This is totally unrelated, but screw it, it's my channel. I know I shouldn't get involved in other nations' politics, but I'm really salty the Whigs were wiped out in Britain in the early 20th century. Every time I read British history, I always root for them, and then they just get wiped out, kind of like how Eddard Stark got killed in Game of Thrones. And I haven't even gotten to home rule yet. Oh, sorry, I should get back on topic. The communists wouldn't win any elections for a while, since they'd be a little too extreme. The slow neutering of the Democrats would mean that the Republicans would completely dominate American politics. And this time the Republicans would be in the pockets of the monopolies, so it wouldn't change anything. There'd be no New Deal, which you could argue did or didn't help the economy, but definitely did make people feel much better. And so without it, the discontent would simmer over and the communists would accumulate even more support. The second point of departure is that we need a war to start between the major powers. Let's say World War II is the same in this timeline. However, let's say that during the Korean War, this timeline's Republican version of Truman decides to nuke Harbin and Manchuria to slow down China, just as Douglas MacArthur, the American general in Korea, told him to do so. This would result in Stalin invading Western Europe. Hey, you might say, that's just like that Harry Turtledove series. Since I spend more time on Goodreads than all other social media combined, my review is, good I guess. But why wouldn't you just read Timeline 191 instead? But yes, this would result in a world war between the Soviet Union, America, and China. With having the establishment having screwed up so massively to have a nuclear war, would result in the American Communist Party finally getting elected into power. As the case in every communist takeover and election ever, the communists would take power and suspend liberties and make sure no future elections would ever happen again. America would become a totalitarian state and support similar communist parties inside its allies. To have the Soviets conquer all continental Europe would involve the Americans deeply screwing up. Most simulations of a world war between the Americans and Soviets result in the Russians pushing to the Rhine, then the Americans mobilizing their massive industry and populations to slowly drive the Soviets back. However, the Soviets at this point had 3 times as many troops in Europe as the Americans, meaning that if the Americans deeply messed up, it would be possible for the Soviets to conquer the entire continent all the way to the English Channel. The Soviets wouldn't be able to cross over to England, however, because of the sea and their terrible navy. Having a nuclear war end in the early 50s makes a great deal of sense in hindsight, actually, even though Orwell wouldn't have known it. If humanity was a more humane species, you would expect us to make some sort of treaty preventing us from using hydrogen bombs when they were discovered. In this timeline, with both the Americans and Soviets wanting to keep the war going, but not wanting to end civilization, a treaty might be signed not to after the discovery of hydrogen bombs. Meanwhile, the third point of departure is that the Great Leap Forward under Mao actually has to work in China. In our timeline, Mao tried to sprint China into becoming a modern nation by a series of really bad plans. First, he planned on revolutionizing Chinese agriculture using new communist ideas. However, communist agriculture is very inefficient, and traditional Chinese agriculture is one of the most advanced and developed in the world. The supposed surplus was supposed to support the growth of industrial cities, which need an insane amount of food. However, said surplus never existed, and so industrial cities never could exist. Mao simultaneously tried to industrialize by taking food away from the countryside and redistributing it to cities. This resulted in a massive famine, killing 30 million people, tying Mao with Genghis Khan for greatest mass murderer in history. Mao in this timeline would ask for Soviet subsidies and talent to try to industrialize the economy by building military factories for the support of the endless war with the Americans, as well as not trying as radical agricultural reforms immediately. This would result in at least some form of industry. In our world today, China took 40 years to rise to become the world's second largest economy. So having China go from no industry in 1951 to an established power in 1984 makes little sense. Keep in mind that China's economic growth in our world has been the fastest and largest in all of modern history. However, China today is a well-rounded and functioning economy, which is nowhere near mandatory for a communist state. I mean, look at the Soviets, who finished Russia's industrialization in 20 years by focusing on heavy industry while completely breaking every other part of the Russian economy, making Russia a shell of a nation today. This is the route the Chinese would follow in this timeline. This would propel China into the ranks of the great powers. To make the East Asian nation accurate, we would need to see the Chinese conquer Japan and South Korea. clearly under the American sphere of influence. Also, remember that the Soviets have been able to push halfway down Africa. This likely means that the Soviets and Chinese would team up against the Anglo-Saxon alliance and deal them a horrific defeat. This makes sense as the Soviets and Chinese were allies in our timeline until 1956. Also, with everywhere on Earth under horrific Stalinist states, Khrushchev likely wouldn't de-Stalinize Russia, thus resulting in no Sino-Soviet split. An industrializing China would be able to deal the Americans a surprise defeat in the Far East, while the Russians would be able to launch an simultaneous offensive across the Mediterranean. The Chinese conquest of Japan would further make them one of the main powers, being able to cannibalize one of the largest world economies. The Sino-Soviet split would still come, as China would become powerful enough to threaten Russia's Siberian provinces, and the Anglo-Saxons weak enough that they wouldn't be a great threat. Remember that there are 4 million Russians on their side of the border, and 200 million Chinese on theirs. Russia lives in a permanent state of fear of China stealing their eastern provinces, even if they've hidden it now as part of their alliance. Eurasia would inevitably align with Oceania, and the Triple World Order would inevitably start. In general, the war stagnated into this for the next 25 years, with the sides and alliances switching to prevent any one power from becoming too dominant. This is pretty accurate. None of the sides can defeat each other, simply because they're all so massive. It's in their self-interest to make the war go on forever, and so they do. The smaller nations are slowly devoured. Latin America is conquered by Oceania, and the Soviets conquer these small European nations like Portugal and Sweden. I don't really see any point to this, but if you look at how many actual nations were devoured in World War II, it seems quite plausible. Latin America was already pretty much a collection of American puppets at this point. Hell, the word banana republic comes from Central American countries practically being run by US fruit companies. This would wrap Oceania up in a massive guerrilla campaign in Latin America that would weaken it. Imagine how hard conquering mountainous of Bolivia or massive Brazil would be. Maybe this would allow the East Asian Eurasian breakthrough we talked about earlier. I'm not sure about the polar front, however. Supply in this region is practically impossible, and any attacks would be easy to defeat. The Eurasians could conquer Iceland, but so what? The Oceanians can just cut the island off and starve them. The Oceanians land someone in Kamchatka, the Eurasians simply cut it off from the rest of Siberia. On the other hand, that's probably the point. Strategic objectives here are so useless that they're not decisive, and thus will not result in an end to the war. Orwell's understanding of technology in communist nations is very accurate. He says that technology only advances in a few government-sponsored fields, like surveillance and a few military technologies. This is definitely true of the Soviet Union, which excelled in a few very specialized forms of physics, but was horribly behind in everything else, especially biology, which had almost joke-like levels of inaccuracy. Orwell's view of the advance of telescreens, rockets, and massive aircraft carrier, sea-based structures, while the stagnation of everything else seems pretty accurate. Do you want to write a novel so incredible that future alternate historians will look back on it to its plausibility and great story structure? Well, nothing to fear, Skillshare is here. Skillshare is a massive platform with thousands of classes and thousands of topics taught by people who have succeeded in said topics. If you're interested in writing, there's classes in that. If you're interested in the fine arts, like painting and drawing, there's classes in that. Hell, if you want to lead a rebellion against your Orwellian state, Katniss Everdeen style, I'm sure the leadership classes would be right up your alley. I checked it out and it seemed pretty interesting. I mean, how can you hate in a place that has a video on how to use science to explode an elephant? And the greatest thing is, no matter what your interest is, you'll find something for you there. And the first 500 people to click on the link in the description get 2 months free access, so click away. Whatifalthist, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed that video, please comment, subscribe, and support me on Patreon. You should check out Skillshare, and if you liked that video, you'd probably like my videos on The Handmaid's Tale and the domination of the Draca, the only dystopian I've ever read which is more screwed up than 1984.